Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are really strapping in for quite a ride. We're tackling some incredibly high-stakes theology,
Oh, you really are.
diving into one of the most compressed, mysterious, and definitely hotly debated parts of the book of Revelation.
That's for sure.
Our focus today is on a single, really crucial group, the 144,000.
Yeah. And it's, incredibly dense material we're looking at. Our listeners' sources present this fascinating web of interpretations, all built on some very specific theological equations.
Equations, yeah, that's a good word for it.
The ultimate destiny of this group, whether they get transformed while they're still alive or if they actually die as martyrs and then get resurrected, that question, that's the hinge point for some massive end-time debates. We really need to unpack those arguments carefully.
Okay, let's do that. Let's unpack this. So our mission here is to navigate these complex, often conflicting views. But first, like you said, we have to establish the framework, the groundwork that our sources are operating within. We need to define who these people are and when they're active. Because, as you hinted, the sources kick things off with this very clear, almost geometric set of identity mergers.
Right.
It basically defines the entire prophetic sequence they lay out.
Absolutely. Foundational stuff. We can't even begin to analyze their final fate, whether they live or die, until we understand these roles they're assigned right at the start.
So where do we begin? What's the first big merger?
Well, the first premise is this really powerful identity link. The 144,000 mentioned first in Revelation chapter 7, the ones described as being sealed from the 12 tribes of Israel.
Right, the famous sealed tribes.
They are assumed, in these sources, to be the exact same group as the 144,000 who show up again later in Revelation chapter 14.
Okay, and chapter 14 is where we get that really rich, almost poetic imagery describing their character, isn't it?
Precisely.
They're the ones standing there on Mount Zion with the Lamb. They're singing this new song that apparently no one else can learn. They're described as purchased from the earth, undefiled, like virgins, and they follow the Lamb absolutely everywhere he goes. And crucially, they're explicitly called the first fruits, redeemed from humanity.
That's the baseline definition of their character, according to these sources.
Yeah.
Highly consecrated, spiritually pure, and belonging completely, utterly to God.
Okay.
But here's the major structural assumption, the one our sources make, that just exponentially increases their importance in the whole narrative.
Go on.
This singular group, the 144,000, is also explicitly equated with the two witnesses described back in Revelation 11.
Whoa, okay, hold on a sec. I have to stop you there because that feels like a massive interpretive leap.
It's significant, yes.
The two witnesses traditionally are often seen as two specific individuals, maybe Moses and Elijah or Enoch and Elijah. People who prophesy publicly are killed and then resurrect.
Right. That's a common view, yes.
But the 144,000 is this huge symbolic number. It usually represents like the fullness of the sealed saints, maybe from Israel, maybe the church. How do the sources justify squishing those two very different images together?
Well, the rationale presented is that the two witnesses aren't meant to be taken as two literal individuals. Instead, they're seen as a symbolic representation of the entire witnessing body of saints during that period.
Ah, okay.
Okay, so the 144,000, in their view, operate with this unique, unified authority during the first half of that final 7-year period. The number 2 isn't literal head count. It signifies their perfect, complete, legally sufficient testimony, like the Old Testament requirement for 2 witnesses to confirm something.
I see. So the 144,000 collectively embody the power and the mission described for the two witnesses. It unifies the idea of being sealed and protected with the act of prophesying and witnessing.
That's the logic, yes.
Right.
It connects their protected status with their active mission. But the sources, they don't stop there. They layer on yet another identity onto this already complex group.
Okay, what else are they? This is getting complicated.
It is. So furthermore, this same group, the 144,000, 2 witnesses, they are also collectively identified as the place of preparation, the Ibicho. In the original context discussion, mentioned in Revelation 12, verse 6.
The place of preparation.
Exact.
That's the refuge, right, where the woman usually understood as the faithful church, or maybe the whole body of protected believers, is nourished and kept safe for 12,260 days.
Exactly that place. So, according to this framework, the 144,000 are that place.
Wow. Okay, so if you accept this whole interpretive structure, The 144,000 aren't just some group of sealed saints passively waiting for the end.
Not at all.
They are the active, prophesying, divinely superpowered agents, and they are simultaneously the literal protective shield, the safe zone, the infrastructure keeping the wider body of believers safe during that critical initial period of intense persecution.
You've got it. Their very existence, in this view, becomes functionally non-negotiable for the survival of everyone else who remains faithful.
Which means the success of the entire end-time story, as they see it, hinges completely on the 144,000 being able to do their job, both prophesying and protecting.
Precisely, and that's why any discussion about their fate, whether they live or die, in the end, absolutely must account for this critical role they play as the place of preparation. You can't separate their destiny from their function.
Okay, that sets the stage incredibly well. Let's nail down the time frame then. We keep mentioning this period. What specific slice of tribulation are they active in?
Right. The era we're focused on here is consistently identified in the sources as the first half of the 7 years. Sometimes it's referred to, more simply as the first week in Daniel's prophecy, or specifically as the first 260 days.
And this isn't just any period. It's marked by escalating judgment. Yeah. The sources link it specifically to the time of the sixth trumpet judgment, and also the beginning of the beast's rule. So just to be clear, this isn't the absolute final fiery end of everything, but it's like the initial brutal opening phase of total global conflict and very organized state-sponsored resistance to God.
That's vital context, absolutely. The judgments are definitely unfolding, things are getting bad, but at the same time, the beast's kingdom, this global power structure, is actively consolidating its command structure.
And to really understand the challenge they're up against, the 144,000, we need to get a handle on who the enemy is. The sources seem to define this primary antagonist through several overlapping titles, don't they?
They do. It's like the antagonist wears multiple masks, but they all represent facets of the same core entity. The sources define this threat through basically 4 interconnected titles.
Okay, walk us through the enemy lineup. Revelation uses such complex, almost mythological language here.
Well, the primary force is often identified as the sea beast. This generally represents the global political and military power structure, the governments, the armies, the international bodies.
The worldly power.
Right. Then this sea beast is closely associated with, or maybe controlled by, the Babylon harlot. This term is often interpreted as the corrupting spiritual or perhaps the global economic system that drives the political beast.
So the political structure and the corrupt ideology or economy pulling its strings.
Exactly. And then that harlot, in turn, is seen controlling the scarlet beast, which might be interpreted as the more immediate military or political enforcement arm, the ones actually carrying out the harlot's oppressive mandates.
Political power, corrupt system, enforcement mechanism. Is that it?
One more layer. There's also the beast ascending from the abyss. This represents the underlying spiritual power, the sort of demonic engine behind the entire Antichrist system.
Okay.
But all these different facets, the political beast, the corrupting harlot system, the enforcer beast, the abyssal power, they're often summarized, consolidated, and given this single centralized identity, the son of perdition.
That consolidation is really crucial, isn't it? It means the 144,000 in this framework aren't just fighting like scattered pockets of resistance or different unrelated problems.
No.
They are confronting a singular, unified, fully established global entity, political, spiritual, economic, a world beast government. That sets an incredibly formidable stage for their mission.
It absolutely defines the scope of their conflict and their prophecy.
Yeah.
And now understanding that enemy, we can really dig into their mission because their actions during this first half are anything but defensive or, passive.
Right. Given the incredible stakes we've just laid out, I mean, their combined role as the sealed, the witnesses, and the place of preparation, let's look at their actual playbook in Section 2. What exactly are they doing? What's this extraordinary power and authority they wield during those 12,260 days?
Okay, so the duration is absolutely fixed. 1,260 days, exactly. It's portrayed as this precise timeline of divine activity, both grace and judgment.
12,260 days, 3.5 years, basically.
All right. And during this specific set duration, they are explicitly given divine authority. The word used is exousia, real power to prophesy. And their appearance is distinctive. They prophesy while wearing sackcloth.
That sackcloth detail, it always stands out. It's not just like a fashion choice, is it? It carries weight.
Oh, absolutely not. Sackcloth in the whole prophetic tradition signifies deep mourning, intense repentance, and an urgent, almost desperate warning of impending judgment.
So it immediately flags their message as serious.
Totally. It underscores that their message is one of confrontation and alarm, not, comfort and ease. It visually sets them apart as these voices crying out against the prevailing world system.
And the sources also connect them really firmly to the history of prophetic power, right?
Hmm.
Through Revelation 11.4, identifying them as the two olive trees and the two lampstands standing before the Lord of the earth.
Absolutely. That imagery links them directly back to that vision given to the prophet Zechariah. The olive trees are the source of the oil, symbolizing the Holy Spirit constantly supplying them with spiritual energy and power.
Powering them up.
Yeah. Which makes them the lampstands the source of light, of testimony, in a world that's rapidly plunging into darkness. But it's their authority over judgment, their actual power, that truly sets up the paradox, the big question we have to tackle later on.
Okay, here's where it gets, frankly, almost unbelievable. Their power isn't just about spiritual encouragement or preaching. It's physical, it's world-altering, it's supernatural authority seemingly designed to just completely neutralize the beast's initial attempts to shut them down. Tell us about the immediate protection they have.
Right. The text is, shockingly explicit about their defensive capabilities right out of the gate. The 144,000 two witnesses are described as being completely impervious to harm, initially.
Impervious, like nothing can touch them.
Apparently so. Anyone attempting to harm them is consumed by fire coming directly from their mouths.
Fire from their mouths. So, like, the words they speak, their testimony itself, carries this instant judgment. Any attempts by the beast's forces to physically silence them just results in instant fiery destruction for the attacker.
That's how the sources interpret it, yes. It makes them utterly unassailable during that period. Their very act of speaking truth becomes a weapon of defense.
They're basically living, breathing, speaking instruments of judgment.
Exactly. The source material really highlights this. Anyone who tries to stop them must surely be killed in this manner. It's like they're surrounded by this guaranteed automatic, fiery self-defense shield that functions as long as their specific prophetic timeline, those 1,260 days, is running.
Wow, okay. And their power extends way beyond just self-defense, doesn't it? It echoes some of the greatest, most powerful prophets of the Old Testament. They wield power over nature itself.
They do. They are given the authority to shut the sky, to prevent rain during their 12,260 days of prophecy.
Shut the sky. No rain.
Yeah, and this is, of course, a direct parallel to the actions of the prophet Elijah, who famously prayed, and it didn't rain for, guess how long?
3.5 years.
3.5 years. The exact duration. This links their ministry directly to a specific historical sign of divine judgment and displeasure.
That parallel can't be accidental. Matching the duration of Elijah's drought with their 12,260 days of prophecy, it strongly suggests their presence is meant to impose this kind of judgment, this discomfort, this disruption upon the world that's aligning itself with the beast.
Precisely. And they have one more really devastating power, this one reminiscent of Moses confronting Pharaoh back in Egypt.
What's that?
They possess the power to turn water into blood. And maybe even more broadly, to strike the earth with various plagues. The text says every kind of plague as often as they desire.
As often as they desire. So they have discretionary power to just unleash plagues.
That's what the text suggests, yes. They seem to hold the ability to inflict localized or maybe even widespread judgment totally at will whenever they deem it necessary for their testimony.
Okay, that's terrifyingly comprehensive authority. If the 144,000 are indeed the two witnesses and they wield this kind of power, they are absolutely not just hiding out or passively enduring persecution during that first half of the 7 years.
No, definitely not.
They are actively imposing judgment. They're dictating the terms of engagement on a global scale, it sounds like.
That is the absolute core takeaway of this section, according to the sources. They stress that this incredible, multifaceted power means that even the massive global forces of the world beast government simply cannot kill them during this initial 12,260-day period.
They can't touch them.
Right. They're not just resisting. The sources use language like they are actively crushing the beast's forces. They possess the offensive capability, the divine authority, to disrupt the entire global agenda.
Okay. If they are that powerful, offensively powerful even, what is the message they're delivering that's worth risking this kind of, well, seemingly overwhelming confrontation? What is the content of their prophecy that the beast and the world find so tormenting?
Well, their core mission, according to Revelation 14 and linked here, is to announce the eternal gospel during this incredibly intense time of escalating trouble.
The eternal gospel. Okay.
But the sources interpret this prophetic message as having a very specific, laser-like focus for that time period. It's understood as a direct, urgent, and pervasive warning against the impending compulsion for beast worship.
So the message isn't just generic believe and be saved. It's the specific, final warning against the ultimate spiritual loyalty test, the ultimate deception of that era.
Precisely. Remember the little book they're told to eat and then prophesy about in Revelation 10?
Yes.
These sources connect that directly. The prophecy that comes from eating that book is this final, desperate warning against worshiping the beast and, critically, against accepting the mark on the right hand or forehead.
So they're essentially giving the world the exact information needed to avoid eternal judgment in that specific context.
Exactly. Which means, of course, that they're actively undermining the beast's claim to spiritual authority and, very practically, its mandatory economic system built around the mark.
They become the ultimate anti-beast declaration, broadcasting this warning nonstop throughout the first half of the 7 years. It makes them the single greatest obstacle, the biggest impediment to the beast achieving total global control, doesn't it?
Absolutely. They are a constant, powerful, supernatural thorn in the side of the burgeoning global regime. And it's really no wonder, then, that the text says the people of the world rejoice so much when they are finally silenced. Their message was torment.
Which creates this incredibly intense pressure cooker environment, doesn't it? Leading us, I guess, inevitably to the climax described in Section 3, the confrontation and ultimately the martyrdom.
Exactly. The breaking point has to come.
So, if they hold this completely unparalleled authority, this impervious protection, and they're actively, as the sources say, crushing the beast's forces, what changes? What's the mechanism that shifts the dynamic? What possibly allows the beast to finally conquer and kill these seemingly invincible witnesses?
Yeah, that's the crucial question. The shift is presented as being both temporal and conditional. Their absolute power, their invincibility, it's guaranteed only until they finish their testimony.
The time limit again.
Right. As long as that clock is ticking on the 12,260 days, they are protected. But the moment that specific period of prophetic duty is complete, the text implies the protection is, well, lifted, and the beast finally gains the authority, the permission, if you will, to act against them.
And meanwhile, during those 12,260 days, the beast's kingdom hasn't just been sitting idly by, right? It's been rising in power, consolidating, and demanding universal obedience. Let's detail that antagonist's rise, how it enforces its will globally.
Right. While the witnesses are prophesying and judging, the beast system is solidifying. The source material confirms, drawing from Revelation 13, that the beast forces the earth dwellers, it's the term for those aligned with the system, forces them to worship its image.
The image of the beast.
Yes. And mandates the receiving of the mark, that infamous mark, on the right hand or the forehead. This becomes the ultimate loyalty test, encompassing both economic survival, because you can't buy or sell without it, and spiritual allegiance to the beast.
So this marks the climax of that first half, doesn't it? The moment when the beast's government moves from maybe coercion or pressure to absolute universal compulsion, backed by the ultimate threat.
The threat of death, yes. The consequence for refusing is immediate and deadly. Revelation 13 is stark. Anyone who refuses to worship the beast's image is to be killed. Anyone. This mandate is presented as universal, applying maximum pressure on every single person, especially those who have heard and perhaps believed the warning message of the 144,000.
And it's this intense pressure, the system culminating in a universal death sentence for non-compliance that finally allows the beast to terminate the mission of the 144,000 two witnesses.
Correct. The pivotal moment, the turning point, comes precisely, the text says, when they finish their testimony, their 12,260 days are up. At that point, the beast that ascends from the abyss, representing that core demonic unified antagonist we talked about, finally gets its chance. It makes war with them, it conquers them, and it explicitly kills them. Revelation 11 verse 7 is just unequivocal. The witnesses are overcome and slain.
Wow. So that period of supernatural immunity just evaporates instantly, and the 144,000, or at least the witnessing aspect of them, who were just moments before turning rivers to blood and calling down fire, they're suddenly publicly killed. Vulnerability returns the instant the mission clock runs out.
That seems to be the sequence. And the event itself is portrayed as shockingly public and significant in its location. Their bodies aren't hidden away. They lie exposed in the street of the great city.
They're great.
And the source emphasizes the spiritual identification of this city. It's spiritually called Sodom and Egypt, places that represent the absolute depths of spiritual rebellion, idolatry, and oppression against God's people. And crucially, it's also identified as the place where their Lord was crucified.
Jerusalem. That detail is just packed with implication, isn't it? It directly connects their martyrdom, their final witness, to the ultimate sacrifice of Christ himself.
It does.
It suggests their testimony in its final, ultimate moment requires them to follow the Lamb even into death itself, underlining the absolute nature of their witness.
Beautifully put. And the world's reaction confirms just how tormented, how aggravated they had been by the 124,000's powerful testimony and judgments. This isn't a quiet, hushed-up death.
No, it sounds like the opposite.
Exactly. People from every tribe, tongue, and nation observe their bodies for 3.5 days. And they specifically prevent anyone from burying them.
Denying burial rights. In that culture, that's the final, ultimate insult. Desecration. It emphasizes the world's deep-seated hatred, not just for them, but for the message they carried.
Absolutely. Total contempt. And the earth dwellers, those who have fully bought into the beast system, they actually rejoice over their death. They celebrate, they exchange gifts. It's described like a global holiday, essentially.
A party because the prophets are dead.
Yes, because as the text says, these two prophets had tormented them so relentlessly with plagues, with drought, with warnings, with fire. Their prophetic power was a source of immense affliction and constant disruption to the beast's agenda and the world's comfort.
So they're finally silenced, the world thinks. And the global populace, aligned with the beast, breathes this massive collective sigh of relief, believing the disruption, the judgment, the torment is finally over.
They think they've won. But the silence, as we know from reading on in Revelation 11, is extremely short-lived.
Right. What happens next?
The divine intervention arrives with perfect timing. Right at the end of those 3.5 days, their bodies lie in the street. The text says the breath of life from God enters them.
Breath of life. They're resurrected.
Instantly. They stand up. An instant, public, completely undeniable resurrection that causes, the text says, great fear among all the observers who are just celebrating.
I bet. That dramatic, visible miracle must be the ultimate validation of their entire message and the final, devastating blow to the beast's short-lived confidence. Their enemies, who refuse them burial, are giving a front-row seat to their ultimate triumph.
Absolutely. Talk about poetic justice.
Yeah.
And while their enemies are watching in terror, they hear a great voice from heaven commanding them, come up here.
The call to ascend.
Yes, and they ascend to heaven in a cloud, completing this incredible sequence. Powerful life, public death, undeniable resurrection, and glorious ascension. And this whole monumental event serves as this clear demarcation line, signaling the end of the first half of the 7 years, the end of that 1,260-day period.
Okay. This detailed, dramatic narrative of the death, resurrection, and ascension of the two witnesses sets the stage absolutely perfectly for the central problem, the core puzzle we really need to tackle now, what the source calls the great dilemma of transformation.
Yes, this is where we need to spend some serious time in Section 4, grappling with what seems like a core logical conflict within the source's own framework. Because we have these two incredibly powerful, scripturally grounded facts that, when merged together by that initial identity premise that the 144,000 AR, the two witnesses seem to stand in direct contradiction to each other.
Okay, let's start with the first side of that contradiction, the paradox of the sealed. We established earlier that the 144,000 are identified as the sealed ones, right? Bearing God's seal on their foreheads, as described in Revelation 7 and mentioned again in 14.
Correct. Sealed on their foreheads.
And the purpose of the seal, established way back in Revelation 9, verse 4, during the locust judgments, was explicit, wasn't it?
It was crystal clear. It's presented as a protective guarantee. The demonic locusts were specifically instructed not to harm those who had the seal of God on their foreheads. They were only to harm those without the seal.
So the seal functions as divine protection from harm.
It implies a kind of divine quarantine, yes. That the sealed are somehow untouchable, protected from the judgments falling on the world, and presumably protected from the forces of the beast as well.
Okay, so here is the immediate, glaring, logical conflict. If the 144,000 are sealed, and the seal means they cannot be harmed, how can they possibly die? Death is like the ultimate form of harm, isn't it?
It certainly seems so.
Resurrection absolutely requires a prior death. But if the seal grants absolute protection from harm, including death, then how can the 144,000 possibly fulfill the Revelation 11 narrative of the two witnesses dying? The seal, by its very definition, seems to suggest inviolability, that they can't be killed.
And this paradox, this tension between the seal's protection and the witness's death, is so strong, so fundamental, that it forces theologians studying this material, including our sources, into one of basically three distinct and, importantly, mutually exclusive positions regarding the final fate of the 144,000.
Mutually exclusive, so you can't hold more than one view.
Not logically, no. It forces a choice. Which scriptural truth do you prioritize? Do you prioritize the implication of the seal, total protection, or do you prioritize the explicit narrative of the martyrdom in Revelation 11?
Okay, let's break down the three views then. Let's start with view one, the one that seems to prioritize the seal above all else. The perspective arguing they must all live and change. How do they make that case?
Right. This argument is rooted almost entirely in the nature and the perceived promise of God's seal. Proponents argue that since the sealed ones are explicitly protected, and that protection is specifically designed to prevent harm, well, they cannot by definition die.
The seal means no harm, death is harm, therefore no death.
That's the core logic. They argue the 144,000 are effectively immune to the death mandate of the beast because of that divine seal.
And if they are immune to death, then obviously they can't experience resurrection because resurrection requires a death to have happened first.
Exactly. So the conclusion they draw is, if the 144,000 cannot die, they must all be transformed without experiencing physical death. This transformation is seen as basically identical to the concept of the rapture. Some traditions hold that instantaneous change from a mortal, corruptible body to an immortal spiritual body, completely bypassing the intermediate step of biological death.
So for this view to work, they essentially have to argue that the narrative of the two witnesses being killed back in Revelation 11, it must be reinterpreted, right? It can't be literal death for all 144,000.
Correct. They might suggest it represents the symbolic death of their public message for those 3.5 days, or maybe the persecution and temporary silencing of their wider organization or influence. But it cannot, they argue, apply literally to the physical bodies of the entire sealed 144,000, because the seal is seen as an inviolable, permanent guarantee from God.
So they point to the earlier description of their power, the fire from their mouths, as proof.
Yes, they'd say that supernatural defense wasn't just temporary protection. It was evidence of an absolute guarantee of immunity that covered their entire ministry. This immunity is taken as proof that the seal's protection is absolute and permanent for the individuals, and therefore they all survive. They're all transformed alive. They endure the tribulation and meet the returning Christ without ever tasting death.
Okay, that's a strong position, definitely emphasizes God's power and faithfulness in protecting his own via the seal. But view two, as you said, swings hard in the complete opposite direction. View two states that all 144,000 die and are then resurrected. How on earth do they reconcile that with the concept of the protective seal?
Well, view two basically prioritizes the explicit, literal, narrative text of Revelation 11 as the ultimate, non-negotiable data point. The argument here is that theology, or the implications of the seal, cannot be allowed to overwrite crystal-clear narrative events described in Scripture.
The story says they died, so they died. End of story.
Pretty much. The text states unequivocally that the two witnesses whom they accept are indeed the 144,000 are killed by the beast after their testimony is finished. Period.
So in this view, the actual event witnessed by the entire world, the bodies lying dead in the street for days, that concrete event, trumps the abstract implication of permanent protection from the seal.
Absolutely. The proponents of view two argue that the seal's protective function must have been conditional or temporary. It was active, yes, incredibly powerful, but only for the duration needed, those 12,260 days, to allow them to complete their specific mission and prophetic witness.
So the protection was tied to the job, not the person, permanently.
That's the idea. Once their duty was complete, the purpose of that specific protective aspect of the seal was fulfilled. And perhaps the protection was lifted precisely to allow them to provide the ultimate, most powerful form of testimony, martyrdom for their faith, which is then vindicated by the spectacular public resurrection.
Okay, so the protection was conditional on the mission timeline, not an absolute permanent shield for the individual. The Bible says they died so that they died. Then they were publicly raised, fulfilling the whole of Revelation 11 and serving as the most powerful warning imaginable to the world right before, well, whatever comes next.
Right. They would argue that accepting their literal death is absolutely necessary to maintain the integrity of the Revelation 11 narrative. If you deny their death, you logically have to deny the explicit resurrection that follows, which guts the entire chapter's climax.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Furthermore, they might argue that the highest possible form of witness has always been martyrdom, dying for one's faith. So having the 144,000, the first fruits, culminate their ministry in martyrdom makes them the highest class, the ultimate examples of martyr witnesses.
Okay, that view certainly respects the narrative flow of Revelation 11, but it does create this really difficult tension, doesn't it, between God's apparent promise of harm-free protection via the seal and the literal reading of their ministry ending in death, which leads us naturally, I suppose, to view 3, the synthesis view, the attempt to honor both sides by stating that some resurrect and some change.
Exactly. This is, in many ways, perhaps the most intellectually complex view, because it's actively trying to harmonize the explicit textual description of the witness's death and their perceived theological necessity of having some saints survive to be transformed. It requires stepping away from the idea that the 144,000 are this single, monolithic block destined for the exact same experience.
Okay, how does this synthesis actually work then? How do they justify splitting the experience of what started out as a single, uniformly sealed group? What's the logic?
Well, they often look at the wider body of saints mentioned elsewhere in Revelation, particularly in places like chapter 20, and they apply those end-time categories back onto the 144,000. They essentially distinguish between two types of faithful people who end up receiving the final, glorified spiritual body.
Okay, what are the two types? Let's start with the first one.
The first group is the martyrs. These are clearly defined as those who refused beast worship and were actually killed for it. Revelation 20, verse 4, specifically mentions those who were beheaded for their testimony of Jesus and for the word of God, and who hadn't worshipped the beast or its image or received the mark. These individuals are universally understood in most interpretations to be witness martyrs who participate in the first resurrection. They get their new spiritual body via resurrection from the dead.
Okay, the martyrs resurrect. Then the second group must be
the survivors. These are the ones who also refused the mark and refused to worship the beast, but somehow escaped the death mandate. Perhaps they were hidden, perhaps they were in remote areas, or perhaps, and this is key for the synthesis view, they were specifically protected by the infrastructure provided by the 144,000 themselves in their role as the place of preparation.
Okay.
These individuals, having survived the crisis alive, will then be transformed, changed in the twinkling of an eye, without actually seeing death. The critical unifying factor, though, is that both groups, the resurrected martyrs and the transformed survivors, ultimately receive the same kind of glorified spiritual body.
I think I see the application now. If you apply this framework back to the 144,000, view 3 suggests that the portion of the 144,000 who acted as the very public, 2 witnesses and were killed in Jerusalem, they represent the resurrection group. Their death and resurrection symbolize the experience of all the witness martyrs.
Exactly. And then the rest of the 144,000, the vast majority perhaps, who continued to fulfill that less public but equally vital protective role as the place of preparation. They represent the transformation group. They symbolize all the surviving saints who endure until the very end without dying.
So this allows the literal death described in Revelation 11 to be honored, but it's localized maybe just to the symbolic too, who represent the public face of the witness, while still protecting the majority of the 144,000 who, according to the framework, must remain alive to protect others.
That's the elegance of the synthesis view, yes. It tries to have its cake and eat it too, scripturally speaking. But, and this is a big but, it brings us smack face-to-face with the biggest internal conflict, the major sticking point within the source material itself, which they actually call the protection dilemma.
The protection dilemma. Okay, what's the dilemma?
This is the critical friction point, the place where the logic gets really strained. Remember, the 144,000 in this framework are identified as the place of preparation, the literal protective infrastructure for the entire body of saints during that first half of the 7 years.
Right, the safe zone.
So the dilemma asks a very difficult logistical and theological question. If all 144,000 die, as view 2 insists, or even if just the 2 witnesses aspect dies, but their protective function ceases, who protects the rest of the saints during those final 3.5 days after the witnesses are killed, but before the resurrection transformation event?
I see. If the entire protective infrastructure, the 144,000, collapses or is killed, then the wider body of saints they were sheltering, the woman in the wilderness, essentially is left immediately vulnerable, completely exposed to the beast's universal death mandate right when the pressure is highest.
Exactly. Logically, it seems the saints cannot survive that final intense 3.5-day period of the first half if their protectors are suddenly dead or gone.
And this raises a severe secondary question then, doesn't it? If the death of the 144,000 does lead to the systematic elimination of all the saints they were protecting, well, then who is left alive to be transformed?
Precisely. The whole transformation narrative, the idea of saints being changed without dying, requires a group of surviving believers who actually escape death. If the death of the 144,000 logically results in the martyrdom of everyone else, then the entire concept of a distinct transformed group seems to collapse. View 3 needs survivors.
That is a very, very difficult problem for the overall theology. If the protective shield is removed right at the climax, just before the supposed resurrection transformation event, the internal logic of needing a transformation group seems almost impossible to maintain. It feels like view 2, all die, creates this problem for view 3, some change.
It does create a significant tension. Now, proponents of view 2, that all 144,000 die and resurrect, often try to counter this. They might suggest that the saints only need to endure an extremely brief window of vulnerability, just those 3.5 days, between the death of the 144,000 and the big first resurrection rapture transformation event that closes out the first half.
So maybe 3.5 days isn't long enough for the beast to get everyone. Or God steps in.
Yeah, they might argue that perhaps specific protection by the 144,000 is no longer strictly necessary for that very brief climactic period, or that God intervenes to protect the remnant directly in some other way.
Or, as the source itself suggests as a possibility, maybe the beast just overwhelms everyone at the very end of that first half, perhaps even overwhelming any remaining 144,000 who hadn't been killed as the two witnesses, making the whole period of protection kind of moot right at the finish line.
Right. They bring up that analogy of the prophet Elijah. He was incredibly powerful, calling down fire, controlling the weather, but he still felt overwhelmed and ended up fleeing for his life from Jezebel's threats right after his big victory on Mount Carmel.
So even great power isn't necessarily constant or absolute.
That analogy suggests that maybe divine power isn't intended to be this constant, unwavering firewall. It could be conditionally withdrawn, perhaps, to allow for ultimate testing, or to fulfill a different prophetic purpose like martyrdom. So in this line of thinking, the death of the protectors, the 144,000, allows for this brief, perhaps horrific period of total persecution right before God dramatically intervenes with the first resurrection and transformation event.
Okay, that's how view 2 might handle the dilemma. However, the source author we're looking at, despite acknowledging that view 3, the synthesis view lacks really clear, explicit textual evidence. The author personally leans towards view 3, towards the survival of some of the 144,000. Why? What's the reasoning there?
It comes right back to that functional necessity of protection. The author seems to support the idea that some of the 144,000 must survive and be transformed precisely because they have to continue fulfilling their role as the place of preparation, protecting the other saints right up until the final moment of translation.
So the author is prioritizing the integrity of the prophetic function, the protective role assigned to the 144,000 in Revelation 12 over a strictly literal interpretation of the martyrdom narrative in Revelation 11, applying to every single one of the 144,000 individuals.
Exactly. Function over universal application of the martyrdom text, essentially. The author suggests that the surviving members of the 144,000 would be the very first fruits among the first fruits, the ones who protect the wider group of sealed saints who are destined for transformation.
So, for this author, the logic of preservation, the absolute necessity of the place of preparation role continuing until the end feels paramount. It's needed to maintain the structural integrity of the whole end-time sequence that includes both resurrection and transformation. The 144,000 simply cannot all die if the promise of transformation for surviving saints is to be fulfilled.
That seems to be the core of their leaning, yes. Even while admitting the scriptural footing for splitting the group's fate is maybe less explicit than they'd like, View 3 acts as a kind of theological glue, trying to hold the whole sequence together smoothly by accommodating both the clear death of the two witnesses, seen as the symbolic public culmination of the 144,000's testimony, and the required survival of the larger protective sealed group needed for the transformation scenario.
It creates this internal consistency by saying, essentially, yes, the witness died publicly, fulfilling that prophecy, but the protector, the place of preparation function, survived within the larger group. They believe that among those incredibly consecrated first fruits, there will be those who receive that initial installment of the Holy Spirit, that down payment, and are changed into their spiritual bodies without dying.
That's the essence of the synthesis argument and the author's preference, navigating that difficult tension.
Wow, okay. This has been an incredibly detailed, really nuanced deep dive into this specific interpretive debate. It genuinely forces you, the listener, to really weigh things up. You have to decide which scriptural necessity carries more weight in your understanding. Is it the apparently inviolable nature of the seal's protection? Or is it the literal, explicit narrative of martyrdom in Revelation 11?
It absolutely does. It's a fascinating point of tension. So let's maybe try to synthesize what we've learned about the enduring kind of non-negotiable significance of the 144,000, regardless of which view you lean towards as we move toward our conclusion in Section V.
Good idea. Because regardless of how they reach their final state, whether they die and resurrect or transform alive or some combination, the 144,000 are consistently defined by that term, first fruits, redeemed from among humanity. They represent the initial spiritual pioneers, consecrated entirely to God and the Lamb.
Yeah, that identity as first fruits is absolutely crucial across all interpretations. It signifies their unique spiritual status as the vanguard, the very first, the initial offering of redeemed humanity back to God in that final age. They are portrayed as the most spiritually advanced, the most obedient, and definitely the most active agents of God's will during this period of intense judgment and deception.
And the sources are also very clear on the timing regarding their power versus their eventual vulnerability or death, aren't they? The sea beast, the main antagonist, only gains the power to actually kill the 144,000, or the two witnesses, once that first half of the 7 years, the 12,260 days, is explicitly complete.
Yes, that timing constraint seems non-negotiable within this whole interpretive framework. Their death, if it occurs, isn't portrayed as a premature defeat or a failure. It's a specific temporal marker signaling the end of one phase and the beginning of the next.
So until that final moment of the first half, the 144,000 are not victims. They are the overwhelming force, actively, as the sources say, crushing the beast's powers, enforcing divine judgments through plagues and drought, and desperately warning the world against taking the mark. Their entire 12,260-day mission is presented as one of offensive, divinely granted authority.
That's a great summary of their role during that period. They are God's powerful countermove to the rise of the beast.
So if we step back and look at the whole picture we've painted, what does this entire complex debate, these different views on their fate, really mean for you, the listener, trying to understand this specific segment of prophecy?
Well, I think it ultimately means that the final fate of this pivotal group, the 144,000, really hinges on how you choose to balance two powerful theological necessities, both drawn directly from the scripture itself.
Two necessities in tension.
Exactly. On one side, you have the necessity of protection. They're a crucial role as the place of preparation, which seems logically required to ensure the survival of a remnant who can be transformed. On the other side, you have the explicit, specific scriptural prophecy of martyrdom, the detailed narrative of the two witnesses' death and resurrection in Revelation 11.
And where you land in that debate, whether you prioritize the functional necessity of survival for transformation, or whether you prioritize the literal martyrdom narrative as applying to the whole group, that choice fundamentally dictates your entire understanding of that critical transition point between the first half and the second half of the Great Tribulation.
It really does. It's essentially a choice between preserving what seems like functional consistency for the overall end-time program requiring survivors and accepting a dramatic, explicit scriptural declaration, the witness's death, at face value, potentially creating logistical questions down the line.
And this tension is just amplified, isn't it, by their unique status as the first fruits, this group, who, in absolutely any scenario presented, represents the purest, most effective, most dedicated form of devotion during what's arguably the most difficult time in all of human history.
Absolutely. Their significance is immense, however their story ends.
Thank you so much for guiding us through that incredibly complex synthesis of text, interpretation, and theological debate. It truly highlights how deeply intertwined the scriptural narrative is, and how just one interpretive choice made early on, like equating the 144,000 with the two witnesses, creates these massive theological ripples that affect the entire sequence of predicted end-time events.
Oh, my pleasure. It's fascinating stuff. And this entire conversation really reminds us that studying prophecy isn't just about reading a simple checklist of future events.
Hmm.
It's much more about engaging in this rigorous, thoughtful debate over the purpose, the function, and the very nature of the key figures involved in the narrative.
Well said. So, as we close out this particular deep dive, here is a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given the absolutely intense protection and the genuinely world-altering power that the 144,000 demonstrate for 12,260 days, a protection so potent it literally consumes their enemies with fire, we really have to ask ourselves, is their eventual predicted death in views 2 and 3 a functional failure of that incredible protection? Or is it perhaps the highest, most public, and ultimately the most effective form of testimony possible, paving the way for their resurrection and ascension? Something to think about.